Welcome to IndoctriNation, a weekly conversation series about protecting yourself from systems of control. I'm your host, Rachel Bernstein.
Hi, everybody. It is so good to be able to speak with you this week. I wanted to start off by letting you know about some of the places that the podcast has been listened to over the last couple of weeks in great numbers, which is always exciting and gratifying. And there's actually a country that's new that I wanted to mention. First, with our listeners, our regular listeners in Australia, thank you so much. And Sweden and Ireland and the Netherlands, and of course, the US and Canada and the UK. And to our listeners, actually, in Japan, thank you so much. Please be in contact if you can and let us know about what resonates for you over there. And so for today, we have someone on the show who is so interesting and so learned, and you're going to learn a lot, actually, by listening to her and all of the research that she's done. Cynane Shay is a nuclear engineer in South Carolina. Her childhood in white Christian nationalism normalized conspiracy theories like Obama's Birther-ism and the biblical apocalypse. But 2020, with COVID and QAnon, finally made her realize something was deeply wrong. Now, Cynane is writing a book, Taking Off the Tinfoil Hat: How Lizard People and Space Lasers Dismantled My Christian Worldview. Losing loved ones to the pandemic was a tragedy, but losing loved ones to the rabbit hole was its own tragedy, and Cynane needed to understand the quote-unquote why of it. So, from the IBLP cult to Jewish space lasers, she pulled the thread, cracked her faith, and found the inseparable link between cults, conspiracy theories, and American white Christian nationalism. Here's Cynane now. It is so nice to have Cynane Shay with me today, and I can't wait to have a conversation with you that's going to be so interesting. That is something we haven't covered nearly enough, I think, on this podcast. So I'm so glad we're taking care of at least delving into part of the conversation today and getting your insights. So I'd love you to take a moment and introduce yourself for the listeners.
My name is Cynane, and I don't even know where to start. I'm from Florida, and that's pretty much all you need to know. So when the pandemic hit, my entire community, including my entire family, got really into conspiracy theories, QAnon, anti-vax, voter fraud, you name it. And I eventually had to face the reality that it was because of my white evangelical upbringing, this ideology that I had been raised in, that they were funneling towards all of these like absolutely insane beliefs, which led to an existential crisis, my own deconstruction. And, I just think that it's a really common story. I hear over and over and over again that they lost a brother or an aunt or a mom or a best friend to QAnon or to, whatever crazy conspiracy theory it was. And I just don't think that enough people are talking about it, that enough people understand the connection between cults, totalistic ideologies, and conspiracy theories, because really it's all the same conversation. And we're in a very unique position in history where I just don't think that we have coped with or even understood what has happened. So many people losing family members, so many, like the political position that we're in. Everything is still like so in flux. It's also a unique opportunity to identify what the motivations are here. And I think that the conspiracy theories really brought a lot of stuff to the surface that had been latent for decades. And we have the chance to point them out and understand them now.
When you talk about things being latent, I think that's really fascinating because I was really wondering, with people who had so much vitriol, hatred, and fear of the other, and, where that all came from, and could it have just been cultivated during the last few years? And it feels to me, right, like it's been there and it's been dormant, or people didn't feel like they had a flashpoint, a trigger point for it that would release it, or they didn't have permission in the same way that I think they suddenly did to share how they felt, no matter kind of how offensive some of their sharings were. And so I would love for you to be able to talk about that too, if you feel like when we're in a period of time where it just wouldn't be acceptable to share those kinds of worries or feelings or hatred or divisive kind of way of looking at society, I think that people keep them under wraps, and then they just needed kind of either an invitation or something that alarms them to release it. What do you think?
Great question. So basically, my upbringing was fundamentally white Christian nationalist, white evangelical Pentecostal, a little bit of Pentecostal, a little bit of the IBLP cult influence, hyper purity culture, private Christian schools, Bible camps, summer camps, all of that. And my community was deeply evangelical. The school and the churches that I went to, all of my friends, their mothers were stay-at-home moms, very patriarchal. I think I had a slightly unique understanding or upbringing in this because my family on the white Christian nationalist scale, I feel like was a little bit more white nationalist than they were. Definitely evangelical and Christian, but they were always very like Republican, a lot of political conspiracy theories and things growing up. They were big into like Obama birther-ism and things. But I was raised in a bubble of white Christian nationalism. And so especially with the private Christian school for elementary and middle school, I did not understand the world. I'm having to go back and like educate myself on just like American history. What is racism? What is like the lie of American exceptionalism, which is kind of a core tenet of white Christian nationalism, that we don't have unprecedented freedom and liberty, that our history is rooted in slavery and, Native American boarding schools and the anti-Asian immigration laws and all of this horrible stuff. So when we say that, something happened post Trump's presidency that we can, say the quiet part out loud, that, it's just okay to be like Islamophobic and racist and all of these horrible things now, it doesn't take into full account just how okay it's always been. Because I was raised in an ideology that taught us explicitly and implicitly that like racism did not exist anymore, that ended with the civil rights and that everybody had equal opportunity in the United States and, very much this principle of individualism. But that is not the reality. People have always been saying and doing racist, misogynist, homophobic things openly. What I think happened recently is we're seeing the culmination of decades of this religious right movement. It's always been there since the founding of the country. But the modern version of white Christian nationalism that we're seeing is uniquely started in the 1950s and 1960s, a little bit with Billy Graham, but then the religious right really got going with Jerry Falwell and Tim LaHaye, the Moral Majority, the Council for National Policy, the Christian Coalition, all of these like religious right lobbying groups that learned to take the evangelical power into politics. And that's been around, like I said, since the 1960s, really is when it began. What I think Trump did uniquely was he combined the religious right, which was already extremely powerful and extremely influential, more openly with like the alt-right. And Sarah Posner, the book Unholy, she does a really good job of explaining that culmination of the alt-right with the religious right. in a way that had not been done before. People had, courted one side or the other, but Trump, said the quiet part out loud and allowed white Christian nationalism to just be white Christian nationalism.
It is so important to track this, and also what caused what. When you see things unfolding and people want to know how it all began, it's very interesting to see what you need as part of this recipe to make and create how it is now. I wonder, because I want to hear more about your family and more about your upbringing, but I just, as we're on this kind of trajectory leading up to now, it's like I'm handing you kind of this fictional crystal ball, if I can, for a moment. And if you can kind of let us know where you think it's going to be going, at least in the near future. What do you envision?
I am not exactly a historian or a psychologist or anything like that. So take this with an absolute grain of salt. I'm also deeply pessimistic. I mean, I think that in the immediate, what we are seeing currently happen, and there's some great groups who are tracking this that you can follow. I want to say American United. Andrew Seidel has written, he's a constitutional lawyer. He's written a couple books about white Christian nationalism. What we saw with the overturning of Roe versus Wade, and from what the Supreme Court justices wrote in their opinions on that, you could see there are already groups who are pushing to overturn rights for marriage equality. It's not like they're going to. They are already attacking at the highest levels rights for LGBTQ marriage. And then what could also be tied to that would be rights to contraception, even things like interracial marriage. They already have so much momentum really pushing for the dissolution of separation of church and state. There's already so much inculcation of the religious right into politics and into laws around education and, government and whatever. They are already, they've already come very, very far. And I think that they're going to continue to do that. I think that a lot hinges on the next election, obviously. And I do, on the optimistic side, think that awareness is growing. For the first time, probably, I heard somebody say white Christian nationalism on CNN this week. So, being able to identify we can't, fight a problem that we don't even realize is a problem and that we don't understand. So I think the first step is just, calling out white Christian nationalism as the, movement that we're fighting here. And then second to that, like really trying to understand it.
There's so much that happens under the radar for so many people while we're busy, saying the Pledge of Allegiance in school and waving our flags for whatever holiday. Behind the scenes, people are orchestrating things. They're changing movements. They are rescinding protections. They're creating division. They're shifting media portrayals to influence people, to indoctrinate. And it's very slippery. And I wish that they could be really upfront about the intention, but people often don't find that all of this has been going on until suddenly a law is passed and you're thinking, how the hell did that get through? You don't realize there are now already millions of people of that way of thinking. And how did they get there? And, there's so much that I have in conflict with this country, even though I think it's, a great place for a lot of reasons and way better than a number of other places, especially for women, when you hear about honor killings and all the different things that happen in other places. Still, I just remember being in elementary school and needing to do the Pledge of Allegiance and then learning about internment camps, right? Like, okay, pledge allegiance to the flag. This is this glorious place. I'm sorry, what'd we do? Really? And knowing that, learning about people who are African-American who couldn't live in certain neighborhoods, and being someone who's Jewish, we couldn't be a part of certain whatever it was, clubs or anything else. And there's a quota in universities, and but still we're supposed to be rah. And so there is this internal conflict that has, I think, been true. And I think also for a lot of women and girls who are raised in these fundamentalist groups that also are protected under the law, but they don't have rights. but they still need to love this country and all the freedoms that it supposedly affords them. It's a complicated mix, you know?
And that's something that I think is really, really important, is just to accept, like, to understand that it is complicated, because white Christian nationalism is kind of this intersection of a lot of white supremacy. Like, it is fundamentally, it's just white supremacy, but then also patriarchy. And then also, I think the part that like mainstream media, mainstream whatever, might be most reticent to address is the Christian privilege. Identifying and recognizing each of the different ideologies is not meant to diminish the role and the abuses that each one does individually, but in order to like truly understand it, like white supremacy and Christian supremacy, like they're deeply interlocked and intertwined, as well as like Christian patriarchy. So we have to, again, just identify that this is the problem and understand our history through this lens, see how we got to where we are today. And basically, once there is that awareness, there's all of these groups that are moving in the shadows, like you said, who are, all of a sudden there's a law passed that has, that's been building up for years and years and years. And it's not that surprising if you know to look for it. And I just think that that's like really the first key step there. And I'm just going to keep throwing in like book recommendations but Ann Nelson's Shadow Network, she's an investigative reporter, and she does an incredible job following the money and showing that there really is this interlocking, organized movement that has been pushing us in this direction for a very long time.
Okay, thank you for that. No, I think people really do want to be able to know where they can read more about it, where they can research, where, kind of who is out there telling these stories and collecting this data. It's actually really, really important to know. And trustworthy sources of the information. It's really important to know. So take me back in time with a special effect here. If we can go back to you growing up in the family that you grew up in, and even how they got involved, sort of their origin story and their connection to this way of believing. So would love to just get to know your history.
As far as I know, my parents were always raised as Christians. And I don't know, but I don't think that they were hyper evangelical. My mother's side of the family is like from West Virginia, Appalachian. So, definitely in the water, but I don't know that they were going to church every Sunday. I've never really talked to them about it. My dad, his side of the family, they grew up going to church and things, but I don't know of what denomination or like how regularly. I think both of my parents were very independent, very free-spirited, traveled the world. My dad did kind of professional surfing before professional surfing was a thing. And my mom, she moved out from Florida to California when she was like 17 years old. And, she traveled, she was proposed to like 8 times or something, like was very independent. And I think that when they had kids, eventually she moved back to Florida. She met my dad. They had me and my brother. I think that when they had kids, especially my mother really wanted to raise us right, really turned back to the church much more heavily and raised us, as I said, in this like white evangelical bubble. I'm from a small town, population's about 16,000 people. I remember when we got the mall, I remember when we got an Olive Garden, like there used to be dirt roads, like it is a small town, but we were raised within an even smaller, more insular community in that town. Very few people of color. And I say that there were kind of 3 overlapping influences. We had the private Christian school that we went to, which was kind of a non-denominational evangelical church. And I find that generally the non-denominational Protestant churches, it's basically just Southern Baptist theology, but like with rock bands and like slightly more casual clothing. And then the church that we attended on Sundays was a non-denominational, generic Protestant church, Calvary Chapel. They started in Southern California. They have like over 1,800 congregations worldwide now. And, I kind of think of them as like the cool kid church. It's like very much like a wannabe mega church. And then the third influence that I really had was my best friend who I met when I was 12, so through all of middle and high school, I would attend youth group at her church, which was an honest Southern Baptist church, which is also where some of my older relatives attended church. So there was definitely like the pure Southern Baptist influence as well. All of these three circles were heavily overlapped. People who went to the school, went to the church, went to the youth group, and a lot of the girls that I grew up with were going to IBLP summer camps. I remember seeing like Bill Gothard VHS tapes in my friends' houses. These were the moms and the parents who were running our weekend Bible camps and teaching in our private Christian school. So like I said, the hyper purity culture was in the water. And through all of this, I was a true believer, raised from birth into white evangelicalism. I didn't know that there was any other way to be. This is how you be a good person. Jesus loves you. I never had a born again conversion experience because I never didn't believe. I grew up learning about Jesus and the Bible and, salvation from before I could read, before I can remember. And I think that one of my saving graces was actually the fact that my mother was so independent and I call her an accidental feminist because she definitely, subscribes to complementarianism, Christian patriarchy, a man is the spiritual head of the home, that kind of thing. But at the same time, and there was a lot of cognitive dissonance, at the same time, she was a firefighter in a time when women were not firefighters. And her work experience, a lot of which happened before I was born, she had a really hard time in the industry. And she always told me growing up, and I think this is also because she had that real world experience when she lived on her own and was independent and dated and had friends who were in abusive relationships. And she saw a lot of stuff that I feel like my friends' parents did not ever see because they never left the town that they grew up in. They got married at 19 years old, that kind of thing. She always told me to focus on an education, that even though I was a woman, that I needed to be good at school, go as high as I could go to college, never trust a man, a man can always leave you, was what she said. I should find a God-fearing husband who would be the spiritual head of my home. But she also had friends who had 2-3 kids, had been married for 15 years, and the husband cheated or something. So I had just enough of this influence of independence and, kind of counter patriarchy that I had more opportunities, I think, than a lot of my friends growing up. I went to a public secular university, the University of Florida, and a den of iniquity. And most of my friends, if they went to higher education, and most of them were homeschooled, if they went to higher education, they went to Bible college. A lot of people went to Liberty University, which was started by Jerry Falwell. And then there were a couple schools in Florida that were Christian schools in Florida. I went to UF. I got a degree in nuclear engineering, a very STEM degree, and very self-sufficient, which is what my parents had always told me to be. Through all of this, I was fully indoctrinated. Did not shake my faith, did not question my beliefs. I went to college, apparently people came up to my parents saying that they were crazy for sending me to that godless school. And in recent years after I've been graduated now, my parents and my brother and several other people have told me to my face that higher education brainwashed me, which is deeply ironic. And again, I have a STEM degree. Calculus is not going to turn me into a communist. But I went through undergrad. In hindsight, I see that I did not take full advantage of, the opportunities that I had because I wasn't prepared to live on my own, to live outside of the Christian bubble. I, lived in a lot of fear, meeting new people, worrying if they were Christians or not, if it was okay for me to be friends with them, if they were going to be a worldly influence on me, or, the pressure for me to be a light to save them. Just really kind of discourages branching out, and I eventually did, make friends in the nuclear engineering department. And I did branch out, but it did not shake my faith. Ultimately, people ask all the time, like, when did you start to doubt? And I was like, never. They did a really good job indoctrinating me with conspiracy theories, because this played a huge part in my deconstruction and my, waking up. There were moments growing up that I did recognize were not right. Obama birther-ism. Obama was the president, I want to say that around the time I was in early high school, and I didn't know any better. My parents said that he wasn't born in the United States and he wasn't eligible to be the president. And I was just like, okay. But I was like, well, I don't really know anything about politics. I'm just going to, I trust them implicitly. And it wasn't just my parents. It was all of my friends' parents. It was my preachers, my pastors, my teachers. I was like, I guess they just know more than I do, but I wasn't like running around debating it with people at school or anything, because I just didn't know. And then things got progressively worse. And I do think that it was partially because of the Obama presidency and just white supremacy. I think that we'd always had guns, but they got a lot more guns. Suddenly we went from having like a gun or two guns to having a locker full of guns. Borderline like doomsday prepping. And my mother had always been deeply obsessed with the rapture, telling me when I was, maybe 10 years old that like based on biblical prophecy, Jesus was coming back in her lifetime and that I needed to be ready. And it was just something that, we accepted. That was just a part of, eventually at any moment, Jesus was going to come back. Of course, rapture anxiety, anytime I lost my mom in the mall or the grocery store. God forbid I hear a trumpet. Like there was a bucket of corn seed in our pantry at one point, and I'm pretty sure that it was there for my parents to farm their land in the event of an Obama communist uprising. And I knew at least one family, maybe two families, who had an actual underground bunker. And fast forward through undergrad, because I wasn't home as much, when Obama transferred power to Trump in January of 2017 or whatever it was, my mom launched into it was actually very awkward. I contract for the Navy and the nuclear propulsion training program. And I had just graduated from this training program that I then turn around and teach in. And I lived in an apartment complex, and there was a lot of military people in the apartment complex. And my parents were visiting, and they found some naval officer who's like a solid 22 years old. Like we have a child, and my parents corner him, and my mom just goes off on this rant about how she'd seen this thing on YouTube about when Obama refuses to relinquish power to Trump and declares himself to be the Muslim king of the United States. What? Who is it true that the chief nuclear admiral of the Navy becomes like the head of the real America, and he's the guy who gets to decide when we nuke the White House? And I mean that's insane and kind of hilarious, but it wasn't really tied to anything deeper for me at the time. Now in hindsight, you look back and you're like, oh, that's so funny, like whatever. But I mean, at the time, I recognized oh, this is insane. This is crazy. I extracted them away from this poor 22-year-old nuclear officer. And he was so kind. And he had this thick Texas accent. And he was just like, well, ma'am, I don't rightly know. And, and I told him, I was like, you can't be saying crazy things like this to people. Like, where did you see this? And both of my parents, their only reaction was then to yell at me for being disrespectful, and that they could talk to whoever they wanted to talk to about whatever they wanted to talk about, and that I just didn't know what I was talking about. And there were incidents like that over the years from high school through undergrad, through the few years after when I started working, where I understood that they believe some crazy stuff, but I didn't tie it to anything deeper. I didn't, I just thought, oh, either they're old people and, they just believe some crazy things, or it doesn't really matter, oh, they believe I didn't even think I knew to call it a conspiracy theory. It was just something. And it wasn't until the pandemic when basically we just reached a point of overwhelming cognitive dissonance, The conspiracy theories were just so obvious and so rapid fire and coming from so many different places that I couldn't ignore it anymore. And it started in July of 2020. So it was during like the first big summer spike when we did not have vaccines. And I was considered an essential worker. So I was still going into work. And my best friend, who I'd known since I was 12, she had been planning to come stay with us on her way up from Florida to North Carolina to see some family since before the pandemic. And then the pandemic hit. And, I told her, I was like, if you need a free place to stay, you can still stay with us, but understand that I'm an essential worker. I'm potentially exposed. Like there's an element of risk here. Like, and normally when people come to visit, we do the whole tourist thing. We go out to all the restaurants and the sightseeing and like we do a whole thing. And I told her, I was like, we're not going to be able to do that. She was like, yeah. She comes, she stays the night, and she's exactly my age. We have the same birthday. And she immediately gets out of the car, asks if she needs a face mask. And I was like, yeah. And she was like, oh, haha, this is the first time I've ever worn a face mask in July. And I had not truly encountered any hardcore like COVID denialism up to this point, and it's hard to talk about this stuff now because in hindsight, it's so obvious. But at the time, this is like the first thing that you're kind of hearing in that direction. So I was like, oh, that's a weird comment. And we just moved on. She spent the rest of the weekend basically making fun of us for taking COVID seriously, being kind of annoyed that we weren't going into any restaurants or anything. And her best friend, when I was an undergrad, she was teaching English in Taiwan through an IBLP program, the Institute in Basic Life Principles called. And her best friend that she met teaching English over there was a girl from California. I'd met her once. She was posting rapid fire on Instagram, a bunch of conspiracy theory stuff, talking about how there's an imminent communist wave about to take over the country. And a lot about stuff about the Antichrist, a lot of stuff about biblical end times. Like these are biblical end times. The rapture is imminent, talking about how face masks were child abuse and face masks were slavery, just like a whole bunch of like crazy stuff. And this was the craziest thing that I had seen to that point. And I was talking to my friend about it and I was like, whoa, what's going on with this California girl? And she just was not bothered. She's like, oh, I don't know. Like, oh, you don't believe in any conspiracy theories? And I didn't know how to answer that question. I was like, what, like Bigfoot? Like, maybe. And she left. And the very next day basically changed the trajectory of my life. She sent me a voice message that essentially is why I have deconstructed and what launched me down like this whole path. And it was like, oh, because we've been talking about conspiracy theories yesterday, I thought you might think this is interesting. My best friend from this church that she went to in our hometown, and it's a small town. I know multiple people who go to this church. She's like, my best friend from this church told me that when the COVID vaccines come out, they're going to be full of secret metal, and that the metal in your blood is going to interact with 5G radiation in order to either control your mind and make you vote Democrat or kill you. She wasn't sure which one. And one, I'm a nuclear engineer and you're talking to me about 5G radiation, conspiracy theories, and it's just like insulting. Right. And two, first I was like, oh, that's so fun. Like your friend found this crazy thing online. Like, oh, that's crazy. And I didn't think that she believed it. And then she was like, no, she believes this. And basically at this point I became concerned. I started paying more attention. My friend was not an old person. This was not normal behavior for her. She had not been like really interested in conspiracy theories before the pandemic. This was just strange. And when I started paying attention, I started seeing everybody on Facebook and Instagram posting similar content, talking about, patriots and a lot of stuff about like child sex trafficking and how Trump was like, fighting the deep state. People were started sending me videos, like my mom and my friend's mom, talking about George Soros and Bill Gates and how they were running some sort of satanic cabal and, a lot of like fear mongering over like the vaccine that was still imminent. And my mom was sending me videos from Judy Mikovits, who was in the Plandemic documentary, which was a huge vector point for conspiracy theories spreading. And then Simone Gold, who is or was the head of the America's Frontline Doctors Association, which is the group that really popularized the hydroxychloroquine conspiracy theory. My dad only has one lung and is over 65 years old and is a cancer survivor. So he was the definition of high risk, but my parents were stockpiling hydroxychloroquine and were taking ivermectin, which is a horse dewormer, and vitamin D, and thought that this was going to protect them from the pandemic. My brother was in the same vein. I reached out to him thinking that maybe he could, he lives with my parents, maybe he could talk to them and get them to take the pandemic seriously. And he just told me that the CDC was lying about the death toll and that we should just let the weak die, even though that included our dad. It doesn't make any sense. And during all of this, we were planning our wedding.
Okay. Great.
So the weekend after my friend came to visit and that started all of this, my now husband proposed. And so I, of course, asked her to be the unofficial maid of honor. And then two or three other bridesmaids, two other bridesmaids from my hometown. And once I figured out what QAnon was and that I could put a title to it, and I understood, that it came from 4chan and then 8chan, and it's this weird, just I'm in engineering, so I know nerds, right? I had heard of 4chan before. I had heard of 8chan before. And, most people in my hometown, you're lucky if they know what Reddit is, which is, the much more civil side of these websites. And I understood what trolling was and internet culture and these inside jokes that is really what QAnon kind of spawned from. And it was so obvious, but it's so outside the realm of their understanding of anything that when I tried to explain it to my friends and family, they just thought that I was ranting about, oh, that's just Cynane with her nerd stuff. And they were like, oh, I don't know what Q is. I don't know what QAnon is. I don't believe in mole children. I don't believe in adrenochrome. That doesn't apply to me. And they couldn't see that it was connected. But at the same time, one bridesmaid was talking about Wayfair shipping children. And there's a whole thing about that if we remember, remind me to talk about the pastel QAnon summer of, I want to say 2020, Wayfair shipping conspiracy theory it really is what mainstreamed QAnon. The same time that this stuff hit me with my friend visiting in the summer of 2020 was the same time that it exploded in mainstream media. It hit Facebook and Instagram at the same exact time. So it's not a coincidence that this is when I was introduced to it because of the Wayfair child shipping conspiracy theory, and the popularization of a lot of sex trafficking misinformation. That's what really blew all this stuff up. But yeah, so one bridesmaid was like, oh, I don't believe in QAnon, but was talking about Wayfair. Another bridesmaid was like, oh, I've heard about this. Her aunt, who's a woman that I've known my entire life, apparently had gone hardcore into QAnon. She'd been hard pilled. They couldn't get her off the computer. She was doing her own research all the time, deep into the message boards and things. And she had told my bridesmaid that all of the hurricanes that hit Florida in 2020 were man-made by Jewish space lasers, with the intent of sinking the state of Florida because DeSantis had given them too much freedom. And when I had that conversation, that was, we went from 5G radiation mind control to Jewish space lasers. Now I'm okay, now this is the craziest thing I've ever heard of. And I had barely scratched the surface of the people in my hometown. I figured out what QAnon was. I went to tell my friends and family about it because I wanted to pre-warn them about it. I had barely scratched the surface and had found just the most feral, rabid anti-Semitism possible with the littlest bit of digging. And by this point, it was trying to, use a bucket to put out a wildfire. It wasn't just my brother or my mom or my dad or my bridesmaid or my other bridesmaid or my maid of honor or, all of their families. It was literally every single person in the community that I grew up in. And it was overwhelming. When we got married, I eventually just had to uninvite my best friend from our wedding because she was like, I can't believe you don't believe in child sex trafficking. And was refusing to get the vaccine and was endangering other people. And to be clear, sex trafficking, labor trafficking, adult and child trafficking, all very, very real and serious issues. But the QAnon version of this actually hurt the cause and was flooding legitimate law enforcement and charity organizations with false accusations and false tips on the hotlines and things, to the point where multiple organizations had to come out with official statements condemning QAnon and condemning like the Wayfair shipping conspiracy, because it was actively harming the cause that all of these women were like so concerned about.
Oh, yeah. I remember Save the Children was drowning. I mean, it's a wonderful organization, but not the one that was made up to quote unquote save the children, according to QAnon. Also, just to say before you continue, one of the things that happens when I hear people say, no, this is a whole other way of looking at things and it's unique and we now have the ticket to the truth. We've uncovered the truth. What is so interesting about these things that are so unique in their thinking, supposedly, is that they all devolve in the same way into hatred of the other, into anti-Semitism, into xenophobia. So how can they be such unique thoughts if they all follow the same trajectory, winding up in the exact same place? And so I think the whole thing also with the adrenochrome and, likening, I mean, it really is sort of this tie-in with the blood libel that, Jews were killed for over millennia. And also for people to know, and I mentioned this actually one time a while ago on the podcast, and it's a weird thing that you feel like you even have to explain this. Or sad thing, I should say. The idea that, with QAnon, that people are going to be extracting something from children to use for their benefit, just like it was talked about the Jews stealing the blood of Christian children to make their matzah. I mean, it's so disgusting of a principle, but also it is the exact opposite of what any Jewish person would do, because if there's any blood in any of our food, even in an egg, when you open an egg, if there's a dot of blood, you can't use it. It's not kosher. And so just being able to have people say and kill Jews over that somehow they stole the blood of children to use for their matzah, it's exactly that would make it non-edible for a Jewish person. But none of that matters, right? Like, it's not logic-based, it's not fact-based, no one asked. But it becomes it's like with George Soros, like it's just like the usual suspects over and over and over again. So how can this be such a unique thought, right?
So I'm writing a book about all of this, about the connection between conspiracy theories and cults and my experience and my deconstruction. And really the first half of it is kind of just the conversation that we've had and just trying to really show and prove that this is a problem. And it is fundamentally anti-Semitic, as most conspiracy theories are. And exactly as you said, blood libel started sometime in I want to say like the 1100s. It was like a medieval thing. It was like some Byzantine monk or something wrote a pamphlet, passed it out, said that Jewish people were kidnapping priests and young Christian children to perform some sort of satanic blood ritual. None of this was actually happening, of course, but that has literally stuck around since 1100, since the Middle Ages. And then the other thing that's like, really important to point out is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this was actually a French satirical political pamphlet that was written sometime in the late 1800s. A couple years later, somebody found it in like Eastern Europe, plagiarized it, swapped out the bad guys for Jews, and then republished it as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And it's been published under several different names throughout history, but it was just in time for Hitler, and it got really, really popular. Ford, the truck guy in the United States, was deeply anti-Semitic, passed out his own version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Hitler used it in his anti-Jew propaganda. And basically the conspiracy theory is that there is a global cabal of Jewish elites who are pulling the strings of global governments and economies to drive the world towards one world order and what have you. And so when you look at conspiracy theories, anything that's like really overarching, like world building, flat Earth, it's just a plagiarism of a plagiarism. It's just regurgitating the protocols of the elders of Zion. Flat Earth says that there is a global cabal of satanic elites who are tricking everybody into thinking that the earth is round. QAnon said that there is a global cabal of satanic elites that are pulling the strings of global governments and economies. And, if you go to 8chan or, where the conspiracy theory was actually being posted, like there are explicit references to Jews by people posting about this. But for the most part, it's watered down. So they don't say Jew, but like everybody knows what you're talking about. So it's fundamentally anti-Semitic. And then the other big part of QAnon is that the global cabal is trafficking hundreds of thousands of children. In some cases, the conspiracy says that they're breeding children in order to traffic them, hence mole children, and that there are tunnels under every major city, and that Donald Trump is the only person who is powerful and elite who is not a part of the cabal, and that George Soros, Bill Gates, Hillary Clinton, Obama, these are the people who are like running this organization. So my friend was really into the trafficking conspiracy theories. And that was, like we said, in the summer of 2020, what mainstreamed it, what got it onto Instagram and Facebook was basically this appeal to Christian and Mormon mommy bloggers. And it was a purposeful campaign that like some QAnon influencers purposefully soft-pilled people, took this trafficking misinformation, put it onto mainstream social media platforms. And these mommy bloggers who already had really well-established social media accounts, and at the same time, this was the summer that BLM was really taking off. They wanted to feel like moral crusaders and, all of the social justice work that was going on with BLM, but white supremacy. So they, couldn't get behind BLM. So what's more important than fighting racism? Child sex trafficking. And so they called this pastel QAnon because all of these like Mormon Christian mommy bloggers would take this misinformation, make it really pretty with like pastel colors and like aesthetics, and then regurgitate it ad nauseum. And there's some really interesting articles that track like the actual statistics of the growth from July to August. It is exponential. So my friend got wrapped up in that. She was very concerned about child sex trafficking, very obviously concerned about biblical end times. My family, my immediate family, was more interested in the anti-COVID, anti-vax conspiracy theories. And that's where RFK Jr. was really huge. One of the top 12 disinformation distributors during the pandemic. And he has his Children's Health Defense Organization that is literally just like an anti-vax organization to like encourage parents not to get their children vaccinated. And he would speak at events and at rallies and things. And one of his, more infamous statements was that, even in Nazi Germany, you could run and hide in an attic, but we anti-vaxxers, there's like no escape for us. So basically saying that they had it worse than Anne Frank, who was murdered in a concentration camp. So just the most vile anti-Semitism. So it's connected to horrific anti-Semitism and racism. And it's also, the white supremacy of like the counter BLM movement. It's also connected to counter work against actual sex trafficking charities and things. And then just the obvious effects of not getting necessary medical care during a global pandemic,
Right. It's truly incredible. And it's interesting you mentioned Ford because, what a nasty guy. I remember learning about him introducing square dancing more into American culture so that it would take the place of jazz dancing, which was evil and which was African American and sinful. And that square dancing, you stayed a certain distance from each other and you only touched for a certain amount of time. And you had to follow the steps that you were given. You couldn't do your own thing like within jazz, which was going to be much more sinful. So that was his way of kind of trying to control the masses by making sure, even though square dancing already exists, but still he made it very popular and paid school districts, paid people to bring it into their schools so that they wouldn't enjoy jazz. And that is fascinating to me. So you can look it up. It's really interesting little tidbit. And there are probably other things like that out there that have happened over time. We had no idea what the origin story was of that. I remember also doing an intervention one time to help a family. And I talked about this briefly on the podcast, but also a while back. this family's daughter was getting involved in believing that the storm was coming, that, she had to hide, she had to stockpile, she had to be careful, and everyone else had to be careful, and everyone else was a moron for not, that was the words that she used, for not believing. And her father was very concerned about her being so susceptible to this kind of paranoia, saying that she'd always been kind of gullible, also his word, that she would get caught up in things. Then during a break one day, he asked me to explain why the Jews started the African slave trade. Okay, this man who is concerned about his daughter being open to ideas that he thinks are crazy. And he asked me that seriously. I said, the Jews who weren't in this country? I'm sorry, which ones are we talking about? The ones in Eastern Europe? What? And my colleagues who were there with me, who have dealt with this kind of a lot with different people, where they can see that something is not based in fact, but they can't see it in other areas. They actually saw that I was so shocked. I actually lost all the color in my face and didn't know really. I felt like it was like this weird gut punch of reality of, wow, this idea only goes so far, that people are going to be susceptible, and that the other things, though, seem factual. So they said, Rachel, why don't you go outside, take a little walk? We got this. Thank goodness. I will always be grateful to them. And then they knew the history on it. They could help. But it's just interesting to also see where people don't recognize things across the board. They don't actually see that there are so many things that don't have merit when it underscores or supports their own hatred and their own bias or their own fear. That's when the logic all breaks down. It's very interesting.
Yeah. So basically what happened was I deconstructed out of white Christian nationalism and evangelicalism, whatever you want to call it, specifically on December 24th, 2021, Christmas Eve, the specific date, because I basically just tried to get through the wedding and was just thinking like, it can't possibly be this bad. And I learned what QAnon was, and and the whole world was learning what QAnon was, and was trying to educate myself at the same time that I was dealing with them. So I had an imperfect picture of what was happening. And I was just like, I must be wrong. Like, it cannot be this bad. Don't burn every bridge, just get through the wedding and don't burn every bridge. I burnt the bridge with my 5G radiation friend. I was like, do not show up to the wedding, but everybody else. And almost immediately after the wedding, we got married in the end of October. So December 24th, Christmas Eve, we were visiting, and for the actual wedding, instead of worrying about like the color of the napkins and like the what spoons to use and like typical wedding stress, I'm worried that somebody's going to start talking about Jewish space lasers to my in-laws. And then on top of all of the, like the COVID pandemic issues and things, and we got very lucky that our wedding was timed for kind of the lowest point of Delta right before Omicron took off. And at the time, we thought the vaccines were like 99, 98% effective. So we felt comfortable having an outdoor wedding, but there was a lot of stress. And it was wedding stress, COVID stress, QAnon stress. And Christmas, we were visiting my husband's family. I feel really bad because his sister had just bought this gorgeous new home. They had a new baby. It was baby's first Christmas. We were visiting them for Christmas, and I am having a full-blown existential crisis.
Happy holidays.
I got 2 text messages, one on the 23rd, one on the 24th, from people who do not know each other, one from a work friend, one from an undergrad friend. And they were almost verbatim the same exact text message. And because they knew that I knew everything about QAnon, they both said, help. I'm home for Christmas. My dad is saying some crazy QAnon stuff. What do I do? And I did not have an answer for them because I was like, I've been trying unsuccessfully for almost 2 years at this point. And by this point, I had started reading some more books, how to talk to people who are wrapped up in conspiracy theories, how to talk to people who are in cults, make emotional connections, appeal to your relationship. Don't just try to logic them out of it. Like, I tried every, appeal to their sense of justice. Like, I tried every different angle that I could possibly think of. But it was almost kind of like an inverse intervention, because instead of like a whole room of like loved ones talking to somebody, it was just me against an entire room. And, I texted them back and I was like, I'm so sorry. At this point, if your dad is talking about how the booster shot is the mark of the beast, like, I don't know that there's anything you can do. And it just felt, and I knew that this was not like a my family problem. I knew that this was not my hometown problem. I knew that this was affecting a lot of people, but for me to finally see it affecting people that I respected and cared for was kind of just like the final straw that broke the camel's back. I had been trying not to burn all of these bridges, and I looked around and realized that the bridges were already burnt, just not from my end. And it wasn't just that like, oh, all the evangelicals are falling for these conspiracy theories. It's all of these evangelicals are falling for these conspiracy theories because they are white evangelicals. There is something wrong with the belief system that I grew up in and that I am a part of that has led us to this point. And I had what felt like a physical snap, like in a single moment was kind of my deconstruction. And I've read some books, I've read a lot of books, but since then, talking about people who, deconvert out of cult movements and totalistic belief systems and things. And I think that it was fairly typical that it took me about a year to feel like I had my feet under me again. And my deconstruction was really focused through the unique lens of conspiracy theories. Because I didn't initially start digging into the theology of evangelicalism. I initially started by just trying to read books about conspiracy theories. Why do people believe conspiracy theories? And, I read Suspicious Minds by Rob Brotherton, American Conspiracy Theories by Usinski and Parent, Michael Shermer's Conspiracy. I think he's is kind of like a right-wing person, but his book had a lot of good information in it, and a couple others. And a lot of them are written before the Trump administration. And mostly what those books focused on was stuff like the 9/11 truthers, or Bigfoot hunters, or the moon landing was fake, or the school shooting false flag conspiracy theories, flat earth even, these things that kind of we think of as traditional conspiracy theories that are, you can believe that there was a second shooter for JFK's shooting and live a predominantly normal life, And I just don't think that that is what I was dealing with. It wasn't just like a conspiracy theory. It was an encompassing worldview. And I think there's a lot of overlap. Like, most of what those books focus on are the logical fallacies that all humans are kind of prone to. Fallacy of bias is like a huge one. You are preconditioned to believe that something that agrees with your pre-existing beliefs is more true than something that doesn't. But stuff like fallacy of scale. If something really, really big happens, we think that something really, really big must have caused it, but that's not necessarily true. So for COVID, a global pandemic couldn't have been caused by a little lab leak or a virus mutation. It must be the result of some sort of like global cabal scheme, or kind of this fallacy of magnitude. Like, the human brain just isn't very good at understanding how big or how small some stuff is. Like, once you reach a certain number, it just doesn't really mean anything. Like something on the order of 10 to the negative 28. Like, that doesn't mean anything to us. So when we were talking about the pandemic, X millions of people have died worldwide. The news kept saying like, oh, it's this many 9/11s a day, or it's this many football stadiums, just trying to put it into perspective for something that people can understand, because without that, we can't connect to, the empathy of the situation. We just kind of like write it off. So all of these different like logical fallacies and things, and our agency bias, our intention bias, all of these things that we're just kind of hardwired to be predisposed to, push us into conspiracy theory beliefs, but it didn't answer the kind of big picture, totalistic worldview that I felt I was dealing with. And it wasn't until I found books about cults that I felt like I finally was kind of putting my finger on it. And you obviously have a lot of experience in this. So if I say something that you disagree with, please let me know. But I read books by like Robert J. Lifton, Margaret Singer, Janja Lalich, Stephen Hassan, these people who were cult experts. And my impression was that people use different language. That nobody really agrees on like one specific definition and there are like the ICSA and, there are like official definitions, but like each expert kind of has their own spin on it. And what Janja Lalich and Margaret Singer called a cult was a totalistic, a transcendent belief system, a charismatic leader, a system of control, and a system of influence. And when you look at Jonestown or Heaven's Gate or, the Manson family, or these really, really famous destructive cults that ended in like mass suicide or like mass murder or like what have you, white Christian nationalism is not the same. It doesn't fit that definition. And you hear people who say like, oh, the cult of Christianity or, white Christian nationalism is a cult. And like, on a certain sentiment, like there's a lot of parallels to be drawn there, but it just depends on what language you're using. What really helped me was Robert J. Lifton's language of totalistic ideologies. And instead of conspiracy theories, kind of shifting more towards moral panics, because also kind of digging into the history of the religious right and, the 1960s and the 1950s that I talked about before, you can see that, and it's very paralleled to kind of like historical political totalitarian movements, like large scale totalistic ideologies like adopted into politics. But the Red Scare of the 1950s really provided a lot of fuel, a lot of fear fuel, a moral panic to drive people in the direction of the religious right. And then in the 1960s and 70s, you had the Love Revolution, and you kind of started to form this family values moral panic. And then in the 1980s, you had the Satanic Panic, which again kind of goes back to, blood libel and like all of these like regurgitated conspiracy theories. And then I grew up in the 1990s. And my experience in the 1990s was this very insular community and an alt culture. We had Christian books, Christian movies, music, camps, schools, Christian everything as an alternative to American culture. And I really think that a lot of that was birthed out of the Satanic Panic. That moral panic really pushed us into this alt culture. And the 1960s and 70s, you had the generation of like the Falwells. In the 1990s, you had this massive influence of like the Dobson dynasty. And that's just like kind of the culture influence on top of the political influence. And now we're dealing with kind of what is an outright attack by white Christian nationalism. They've gone from like moving in cultural and political currents into like basically a purposeful attempt to infiltrate and overthrow the government. And my belief is that the moral panic that is really the heart of the totalistic ideology of white Christian nationalism is this family values moral panic.
Interesting. That's very interesting. I know we're about to be done with our time together, but I wanted to say a couple of things here that, when there is this overlap between these political movements, religious movements, and also something happening within our culture that is affecting people psychologically, then you have this perfect storm. Then you have this idea that takes hold, very similar to the Satanic Panic, which affected my work a lot. I was suddenly getting calls from everyone saying that they were in a satanic group or that their child was, because they could tell by the way they were dressed, because their pastor said if they're wearing this or not wearing that, they're Satanists. By the way, it's not a problem to be a Satanist, and I will be talking more about it because there's nothing dangerous about it. But there were true sociopaths who would run these kinds of, I don't know what they were, like services, I guess, and, sitting on a pentagram, and would use that power to abuse people, to abuse animals. But it had nothing to do with Satanism, just sociopathy. But there, along with all of this and people getting worried about people going too far afield, away from religion, away from mainstream religion, or away from, being able to have a good moral code. And then there was this book, A Courage to Heal, that came out during that time, right? Which was very dangerous, very irresponsible. And there's that whole idea, right, that if you have repressed memories, if there's a part of your childhood you can't remember, that absolutely means that you were abused, that you were sexually abused, 100%. So people were then accusing their parents of things, and parents were going to jail, and they hadn't done anything. And people were coming to me saying they're survivors of abuse. It's very hard to make my way through that to see if that was true or not. But they had already connected. That's the other piece of this. They'd already connected with a whole society, with a whole community of people who were fellow victims and survivors. And they didn't want to give that up by finding out, in fact, that those things didn't happen to them. So they hung on to their story of the repressed memory of abuse. It is so multi-layered, so thick, that then you have something like a pandemic, which is going to cause yet a whole other cascade of anxiety, of feeling out of control, needing to gain control, needing to stockpile, needing to believe, needing to have the answer. And so it's so sad when you see this. It's so much part of human nature that just gets triggered over and over and over again in the exact same way and for different reasons. And so I feel like we're living in that time again. But I want you to be able to finish with whatever thought you wanted to finish with, and then we'll call it a day.
Yeah, sure. So basically, when we're having the discussion about conspiracy theories, and I know that this affects so many people, that you've lost loved ones, hopefully not physically due to the pandemic, but, to the rabbit hole, basically. There's not always a happy ending to that, or the happy ending comes after years and years of a lot of hurtful conversations and just hurtful nonsense, the misinformation and the conspiracy theories and things. And why I am so focused on white Christian nationalism is because when you believe that the world, the universe is broken down into the ultimate good and ultimate evil of God and Satan, and, this spiritual warfare and everything, hell and heaven, and what's pushing evangelicalism, penal substitutionary atonement, you view the world through a myopic lens. And this is what Janja Lalich called bounded choice and what Lifton called personal closure. You have to explain events and phenomenon through that myopic lens. So why was there a pandemic? Why did Donald Trump lose the 2020 election? It can't be because the majority of Americans didn't want to live in a misogynistic, homophobic theocracy. That's not one of the bounded choices. When you believe that it's God versus Satan, it must be because white evangelicals were not strong and righteous enough and God abandoned them, or there was some sort of satanic tampering. And so conspiracy theories, when you have a totalistic ideology, conspiracy theories are absolutely inevitable. And when you're talking about conspiracy theories, you are talking about cults. I don't think that we can understand one group or the other without understanding the connection between the two.
I agree. I truly agree. Yeah. Right. And I think that's why people were intuiting, they're calling people like me saying, I think this is the same kind of thing. It feels the same. I saw this special on cults, but this feels like what's happening in my family system, politically or whatever else. But so thank you. Thank you so much for this deep dive, this really important discussion, and so much information and so many great resources also that you let people know about. And I can't wait to see your future book. And that's very exciting. And thank you really for all that you're doing and all that you educated us about today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is wonderful.
My pleasure. One more thing before you go. Thank you to Cynane for her wisdom and, again, her research and how much she has to share. And I can't wait for you all to read her book. One of the things that she mentioned was this idea that she realized that her family's evangelical upbringing had really led them into a belief in conspiratorial thinking. And so it's really good to try to understand that there actually are a number of people who I've worked with who have said, listen, I have relatives who came out of some kind of belief system that would talk about the end times. And so then when they left that, they were able to find kind of a seamless journey into the world of conspiratorial thinking and Armageddon, and everything is going to be ending sometime soon and you need to protect yourself. And it all just fit all too well. And then other people who I've talked to who said that their family member or loved one got involved in or were raised in some kind of cultic thinking where there was an us versus them mentality. We can't trust anyone outside of us. They're up to no good. They're going to be destroying the world as we know it. We have to band together and we're the only ones we can trust. I mean, the irony, of course, within cultic systems is that these are people, unfortunately, who you can trust the least, but they will tell you that you can trust them the most. I mean, they will weaponize your information and use it against you, and there's no privacy, and people are jockeying for position there in very competitive space and will throw you under the bus all too easily within a cult. But still, you are given the impression that these are people who you can trust more than anyone else. And so then when people leave, they will sometimes, or even if they haven't left, they'll sometimes be open to conspiratorial thinking and this idea that there are people conspiring, there are people up to no good, people outside of us, outside of our system, our belief system, where we have to band together so that we are not affected by them, infected by them, that we are not destroyed by them. There is a general consensus that goes into the paranoid, where, again, it is a kind of seamless transition into the land of QAnon kind of thinking and conspiratorial thinking in general. It just fits, again, all too well. What's also true that Cynane brought up is this idea then that these beliefs, these pretty hardcore beliefs about not being able to trust anyone else, or that the end of the world is coming soon and you need to prepare yourself for it, or you need to adhere to this so that you're among the few who will be protected from it, that it then becomes the thing that's most important, more important, in fact, than any of your relationships, more important than your own life, more important than anything. That there is this idea that beliefs take precedence over your friendships, over your family. And they, as I see them, stand squarely in the middle, in between you and your own children. As we've talked about, children in some of these groups will be discarded emotionally, sometimes physically. If your connection to them somehow is getting in the way of you focusing on the belief, focusing on the mission, I think a lot of people will say when they leave cultic groups that they were able to suddenly see that this belief system had become a wall that kept them separate from their loved ones, emotionally, sometimes physically. And that when they left, this wall that obscured and obstructed their view of the other and their connection of the other started to disappear, started to crumble. And suddenly they could see the people they cared about or the people they should have been caring about more than anything else. Suddenly they could see them again, and they could see why that relationship was important. And they could see also that that relationship really should be the only thing that takes precedence. But that is not an option given to people within cultic systems. You have to choose the belief over the people in your life. There is an idea that was crafted by Robert J. Lifton, who is a wonderful thinker on this subject. There is this notion of doctrine over person. This idea that not only do you have to believe in the doctrine over your connection to any other person, but you have to be thinking about the doctrine even over your own person, yourself. And so if you're exhausting yourself, you still have to keep up with the mission. You still have to be recruiting people, even though you're exhausted, even though you're sick, even though you're 8.5 months pregnant. You still need to be out there on the street getting people in. You still need to be believing in the doctrine, even if it's going against what is necessary for your mental health and what's necessary for your physical health, even if it goes against doctor's orders for you to follow what they're telling you to follow. And that is all very dangerous. And it's all very disorienting. And it keeps you, again, from your connection to the people you should and could be loving the most, and you should and could be caring for the most, including yourself. Nothing is more important than that. And I know every cult leader would disagree with me. But what's also true is that now that I've had a chance to meet a couple of cult leaders, it isn't something they apply to themselves. That's something really important to know, because when it comes to putting anything between them and their needs, they wouldn't dare. Cult leaders take very good care of themselves often, while they're encouraging everyone else to put themselves last. And so, think about how people within cults usually are exhausted or sick or not well, but the cult leader seems to be doing just fine. And there's a reason for that. You will find that, as with most of the things we hear about in cults, there are extremes. There usually isn't anything in the gray. The rules within cults only apply to the followers. The cult leaders will be doing okay, usually have money, have medical care, have their needs taken care of first, and sometimes only their needs taken care of. And that's sometimes just justified by the people in the group. And that's why Rajneesh could have 44 Rolls Royces while his followers slept on mats on the floor. Somehow it makes sense there, but remember, it doesn't make sense. And if the rules only apply to the followers, then you're not in a healthy organization that actually cares about you. It just cares about the sacrifice they can get you to make. So if the leader seems okay and you are not, then it's a group that doesn't actually care about you. And it's like sometimes, as I've mentioned on the podcast, when I have people coming into my office, I can tell at times that one of the partners in a couple is more narcissistic in their way because they seem okay and they seem well-rested and they seem relaxed and they seem healthy, while their partner looks ragged and tired and hasn't had time for themselves because their needs are not important. And because most cults are run by people who are narcissistic, this is what's going to happen on a larger scale. And I don't want you to be taken advantage of, as you know, and that's part of the reason that I have this show. So watch out for yourselves, even and especially when you're told not to. Take good care. I'll talk to you next week.
Thank you very much for listening. Please support IndoctriNation on Patreon at patreon.com/indoctrination. Be sure to give us a follow on our social media. Find us on Facebook and Instagram using @IndoctriNation Podcast. And for Twitter, find us at @_indoctrination. We love hearing from you too. So send us an email at indoctrinationshow@gmail.com. And for more updates on the show, visit our website at www.podpage.com/indoctrination.